is Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy, the art of attracting, acquiring, and retaining talent. Here's Kathleen.
Welcome back to my conversation with Melissa Swift, who is currently leading transformation solutions in North America for Mercer, one of the largest human resources consulting firms in the world. We've been talking about the future of work post-COVID and her new book, Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. Melissa, let's get into the part of the book where you talk about defeating the animal farm syndrome, where organizations generate the kind of leaders we love to hate.
Yeah, I'm going to spoil the end of Animal Farm for anyone who hasn't read it already. But, at the end of Animal Farm, after overthrowing at the beginning of the book the farmers who oppressed them, the pigs have basically become the farmers again, right? So Animal Farm syndrome is where you grow up into the boss you hated when you were early in your career. And my point in that section of the book is that we throw in a lot of dollars relatively near the end of people's careers into leadership development, right? Oh my goodness, they're doing all the wrong things. Let's go fix the behaviors. And there's a role for that. But there's also a role for looking at all the structural choices that we make starting very early in career that shape those leaders that way to begin with. Mm-hmm. So for instance, to be successful early in career in most organizations, you need to become a high expert at something. You need to be narrow and deep. And then if you think about it, you get 20, 30 years into your career, we want you to be an enterprise leader. We want you to think broadly. But, oh goodness, that's not what I was rewarded for. That's not what I was coached to do. That's not how my job descriptions read. And we expect people to, again, relatively late in their career, make this big pivot to thinking more broadly. And the people we really torture are our middle managers, who are generally given some little kind of chunk of the organization that they are supposed to sort of be all over. And then again, we wonder why they don't turn into magical enterprise leaders. And these are structural fixes. These are looking at how one job flows to another. This is looking at job descriptions, job architecture, how work gets done, all of these structural pieces that actually shape our behavior just as much as things like the coaching we get.
That kind of goes along too with the whole self-awareness journey. Because to your point, I think I think about when I started in my career, there were little to few transformational leaders. Nobody was thinking about things out of the box. So we were raised in, this is how IBM does it, and everyone else should be like that. And as my gray hair has come in, which we have a lot of now, it really has become more of helping people to understand what their blind spots are so that they can be able to think a little bit broader. Do you see that self-awareness journey as a piece to this too?
100%. And that's how we start to fix right now, right? Because I can't go back and fix your early career years. But to your point, what I can do is coach you to think about your own experience more reflectively. So I talk about in the book, the second you find yourself impressing the template of your own career onto somebody else's, that's your watch out moment. Well, I progressed by doing X, Y, and Z. No. Don't do that. Because that's us kind of trying to mold tomorrow's leaders into yesterday's. And that's the behavior we have to kind of shut down. And instead, to your point, really encourage that self-awareness of, okay, well, in my last role, my incentives led me to do this. Is that still the right thing to do? Is that still the right way to behave? And having those moments of reflection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You also talk about the 3 trends quietly but dramatically changing the everyday experience of work.
Yeah, so this is something, again, you always get asked for. Okay, what are the big trends? And I really see these 3 as being critical, and we kind of sense them, but we don't talk about them. So the first is work is becoming more asynchronous. And this was a trend that was accelerated by the pandemic, but not necessarily caused by it. And that's just asynchronous work just means we don't have to work on things at exactly the same time. So that's asynchronous work is what gets us out of meeting overload. And I am a big critic of meeting overload. I talk about in the book, kill your standing meetings. And you're seeing some organizations do that programmatically. just, okay, let's wipe our standing meetings off the calendar and let's figure out if there's a better way to do this. So, for instance, within my own working teams, we use Microsoft Teams really, really effectively to have those asynchronous conversations where I can ask a question. My colleague on the West Coast, comes on a few hours later and they answer it and we go back and forth. And, we don't have to be in a meeting. And asynchronous work is interesting because it holds a lot of promise for knowledge workers, but also for, let's say workers in manufacturing, right? If we can chop up shifts differently and have one person's work build on the next. There's a lot that we can accomplish if we don't all have to work at exactly the same moment. So that's the first one. Second one is work becoming more transparent. And this is an interesting one because we see some really concrete manifestations like, laws around pay transparency. But in general, this is really a seismic shift in that with better information systems, the information inequities that hierarchical office culture used to depend on are really eroding. So if you think about it, I'm your boss, right? Part of what makes me, gives me power is I know more than you. Well, what happens in a not too distant future where I have the same information that you have, right? How do you enforce that hierarchy? There's a very interesting thing going on there. And we all want work to be more transparent, but it also sometimes places burdens on workers too. So think about if you're a manufacturing worker where you now have better technology to track what you're getting done in a day, that can be helpful, but that can also be hugely anxiety producing. So we have to really think about the implications of transparency. And then finally, work is becoming more deconstructed. And this is something that my colleague, Ravin Jesuthasan, thinks and writes a lot about, that we're actually picking jobs apart and putting them back together and in different ways. And, does this need to be a job? Should this be a collection of projects on an internal project sign-up board? And again, I think this is hugely promising. And the idea that you can make work better suited to people's skills is a really exciting one. But there's also some downside that we need to think about. If I'm doing 37 projects instead of one job, I don't have a boss who's responsible for my career. I don't have a boss who's responsible for my mental well-being, right? There's some potential downsides too. How do we figure out my compensation? So there's a lot to be figured out around that one too. But that third trend of work being increasingly deconstructed, again, I think is a fascinating one.
Do you find that on that third piece, that it is easier and I'm a small business, so I'm a little prejudiced on this, but smaller versus these large global enterprises, that they are able to be more agile in order to be able to deconstruct some of these roles and allow people to really play to their strength of their skill sets?
Yes, I think that in any case, a small unit is a good way to start. So it could be a small department within a large, complex organization. But to your point, you have to know two things really well to do deconstruction. You have to know what the work actually is. And again, you need to be looking through a relatively small lens to do that. And it could be a million small lenses on your big organization, but it's got to be a small lens. And then you have to know what your employees are good at and really understand their skills. And that's something we haven't perfectly cracked the code on yet, particularly around some of these softer skills that are folks truly good at them in practice. And that's where organizations, I think, will need to do some further kind of learning and growth.
Yeah, I think that, that's something that we've been really focusing on the last couple of years too, as we've gotten, I shouldn't say, I personally have gotten more appreciation to the whole concept of, when are you in your zone and you are working at the things that you love to do so much that time passes and you have no idea where time went. So it is an interesting conversation to be having with other company leaders. A few more things that you talk about that we're going to learn from the book is how work has slowly broken down over the last few decades and some of the strategies to fix that. Maybe you could share one of the strategies that you talk about?
One key strategy, and there's a lot of different ways to go after this, but I'll talk about sort of the core of doing so, is de-intensification of work. So, work has gotten so much more intense over the last decades, right? It's just you're doing more things per unit of time. You're picking more strawberries, you're on more Zoom calls in a day, whatever it is. And so what organizations need to do to address this is take a step back and take I talk about in the book, an ethnographic approach of what do your workers' actual day-to-day experiences look like, and what can you just pull out of there? What is wasted time? What is silliness? What is too many meetings? What are too many processes? Because we find over and over when we do sort of this ethnographic work for clients, it's generally not the mainstream work of the job that's the problem and that's causing this intensified day that really burns workers out. It's the everything else. And again, that's across a lot of different kinds of organizations and a lot of different types of work. It's not the main thing that we want you to do that's wearing you down. It's all the other stuff. And that's you have to kind of get nitty-gritty and detailed to figure that out.
Yeah, I bet that would be a very interesting conversation to have with to be able to really understand what that everything else is, because as a leader, I would imagine it's probably a lot more than I personally am even aware of, because they just do it so seamlessly.
Exactly. And the human kind of tendency is to adapt well. So even if we are asked to do things in our job that don't make sense, that break up flow, whatever it is, we do them. We just figure out a way to make it work. But what organizations need to do for us as employees is pull the nonsensical stuff out. And that's when you start to experience that real flow state that you're describing. And that's better for everybody. Employees are happier and more work gets done. It's a shared win.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I am so excited to get your book because it should be arriving today, and I'll probably be taking the rest of the day to really delve into that, because it really is timely for the work that I'm doing in my organization. One of the things that you often say is we need to think bigger and we need to rethink how we work. And as people are listening to this conversation today, what are one or two things that we can all do to get started on that?
It's a great question. I think number one, look at how you use your time at work. So for instance, I color code my calendar by different categories, just to see what I'm spending time on. Because, time's all we have. So how you're spending your time is how you're making your choices. And if you can see that you're spending too much time on frictional things or extraneous things, that's an important message. The other thing is to pay attention to how you feel as you do, different tasks at work. A lot of times, if there are things you never feel good doing, it's because there's actually a lack of logic to doing those things. And you see recently at Google, they actually reached out to employees and said, where do you feel like we could tighten things up a bit? Where would you create efficiencies? And I love that. I think that's the right approach, because your spidey sense as a person, it's sort of like, oh God, this meeting just every week, this seems useless, right? Listen to that spidey sense. And particularly as a leader, ask your team, what does your team always feel a bit weird or off doing? And those are really good cues to the work's not getting done right. And I think if we can have good sort of dialogues about those things, that's where you start to make real progress.
Yes. So I want to get back to what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation around the data. So there was obviously a lot of data that Mercer collects. And how did you incorporate the information that you had from the data with some of the strategies that you talk about?
For instance, we've done some work over the last couple of years, a study called Inside Employees' Minds that's really, really fantastic, that just talks about where do different groups in the workforce, what do they feel like they need that they're not getting? And what that data really shows is that sort of the individual experience of work can vary tremendously across population groups. And it's interesting because other data sets will validate it, that you can see, for instance, if you're ethnic or racially diverse individual, a lot of data shows that you're less likely to be retained by the organization you're at. And sure enough, that showed up in our data, that
Hmm.
these groups that don't feel as included in the workforce are more likely to think about leaving their employers, right? But not a big surprise there. So what do you do? That's the case for, again, delving back into the kind of everyday experience of work, the thing that it's been a bit of the third rail. We're a little bit scared to ask about what people's day to day is like. We like to kind of abstract up a bit and say, oh, how do you feel about the organization overall? But when you start to get into the how do you feel task by task, day by day, that's when you can start actually fixing your employee experience for a diverse array of groups. Where you start to see that variation, that's where you start to be able to make the fixes. But if you can't see the problem, you can't see the solutions.
Hmm. Well, and it gets back to that word feel.
Yes, absolutely. Taking people's feelings about work seriously is one of the big red threads of the book. That,
Hmm.
we can't make the assumption anymore that sort of the organization knows everything and the workers know nothing. It's a lot more fluid than that. And if we can have that dialogue, again, it's good for everybody. Both you have happier workers and your company makes more money, right? It's
Hmm.
the creating those shared wins.
Hmm. How are you seeing all of this relate back to the employee retention issues that transpired over the last few years? Now that people maybe are more aware and are you seeing a change in that, especially as I know executive women were impacted a lot.
Absolutely. So yeah, you're seeing, I think, some really encouraging areas of change. So it, as the kind of great resignation bubbled up, there were a lot of strategies that were short term around compensation. And certainly organizations had some remediation to do. I think it's fantastic. I'm not criticizing those short term strategies, but those were short term strategies. And now where we're seeing organizations dig in is the work in the employee experience. And that's really that's exciting. So for instance, for those executive women, how do we concretely create more flexibility, understanding that you can't just keep paying them retention bonuses, right? You have to
Mhm.
really re-architect their working experience, and that's very encouraging. I mean, I'll give another super concrete example. A lot of organizations have started to look at, do our people touch too many technologies during the day? Are we driving them crazy with the 37 different apps they need to use just to do their job? And I think that's a wonderful development, because that changes that day-to-day working experience that we need to be really focused on. And that's meaningful, and that's concrete. That's not, warm and fuzzy. These policies, flexibility policies, technology policies, these are really nitty-gritty. And these are levers organizations can hit. And I think they're starting to make those real changes that ultimately will impact retention positively, sustainably in the long run.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that, and I think, the magic question of how do you feel?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of organizations are also teaching managers how to check in with people, especially virtually. And that's a wonderful concrete development. You can give even somebody who's not naturally empathic, you can give them good strategies for empathy, right? Here's the kinds of questions to ask. Ask the question and then be quiet and listen to the answer
Mhm.
and react appropriately. These are learned skills and we can teach them. And I think it's wonderful that they're being taught more broadly.
Yeah, I do too, I do too, and I think your operative word is be quiet.
Right. Right. For some people, that's the hardest part of listening, is that listening requires not speaking yourself.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Gosh, Melissa, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I've certainly learned a great deal, and like I said earlier, I am anxiously waiting for Amazon to drive up to my office here and deliver that book. What's the best way for people to connect with you and, of course, again, buy your book?
Great question. So, a few different ways. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on Twitter at MESWIFT, at MeSwift. You can email me at melissa.swift@mercer.com. And I welcome the dialogue. And this was a really wonderful conversation. And I'm excited that, in the work that you do, I think these themes are really prominent. So I'm just excited that we're connecting and having the discussion.
I am too. Well, thank you, Melissa. And I wish you all the best on the success of your book, Work Here Now, Think Like a Human, and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. And we're going to keep an eye out for your next book.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And that's it for this episode of Revolutionizing Recruitment. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left me a review so more folks like yourself can discover the show. Until next time, take care.
This has been Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy. To connect with Kathleen or to learn more about recruitment research, go to duffygroup.com.